Ladies and gentlemen, may we please have your attention for this public safety announcement. This is the Printworks Conference Centre. The Printworks Conference Centre has 8 emergency exits. Exit signs will remain illuminated at all times. Please take a moment to check the exit nearest you, bearing in mind that it may be behind you. In the event of emergency, you will be asked to proceed to the exit and move down the steps to the assembly point located in the lower castle yard beside the church. For your convenience, restrooms are located out the doors to the left. Please ensure that mobile phones are switched to silent while in the Printworks Conference Centre, and remember that this is a no smoking and no vaping building.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out on a pretty inclement morning, but it looks like it's getting better, so we're set fair. You're very welcome to the Dublin Festival of History, which, as you probably know, is an annual free festival brought to you by Dublin City Council, organised by Dublin City Libraries in partnership with the Dublin City Council Culture Company. And isn't it great that we can all be face-to-face instead of Zooming? Although I hope a lot of you have been tuning in to our Zoomed events, of which there have been something like 120 in total, so it's a bumper festival this year. Thanks for your support. Before we begin, I just want to remind you of a couple of housekeeping details. You should wear your masks outside. You don't have to wear them in here if you don't want, but if you wish to keep them on, of course, that's your choice. Maintain social distancing as far as you can when we're out in the foyer there. There will be time for questions at the end, but unfortunately this year we can't use the handheld microphones which we used to pass around the audience. So if you have a question at the end, raise your hands and we'll direct you to, there are 3 freestanding microphones there, and you'll have to parade over there to present your questions, but we'll select the questions. So it's my pleasure to introduce our first event of the morning, which is with Martin Doyle and Susan McKay, talking about Susan's book, Northern Protestants on Shifting Ground. Susan's an award-winning writer and commentator and contributes regularly to print and broadcast media, such as The Guardian, New York Times, Irish Times, and the London Review of Books. Martin Doyle will be well known to most of you as the editor of the Irish Times. So without further ado, can you welcome Susan and Martin, please?
You may open your papers.
Hi, thanks everybody for coming. My name is Martin Doyle, books editor of the Irish Times, and I'm delighted to be here today speaking to Susan McKay about her new book, Northern Protestants on Shifting Ground, which is a kind of a sequel to her first book on the subject, Northern Protestants and Unsettled People. But Susan has been writing about the North pretty much her entire career. In fact, I just bought one of her other books, Backstage, Bear in Mind These Dead, which is interviews with survivors or relatives, people bereaved by the Troubles, which is a very powerful testimony, which I guess brings home just the depth of the importance of this subject. Susan is a former Northern editor of the Sunday Tribune and a co-founder of the Belfast Rape Crisis Centre. She now lives in the south, but is originally from Derry in the north. Maybe, Susan, if we could start off just talking a little bit about your own background then. You're obviously from a Protestant background yourself, but perhaps not entirely a typical one, or perhaps put another way, how you developed as an individual. was maybe not typical for your generation anyway?
Well, I'm of the generation that kind of came of age with the Troubles. So I started going to secondary school in Derry in 1969. So everything was just starting to happen at that stage. So I was born, I can never say now I was born into a Protestant family in Derry without thinking of how this was put to me in an accusing way by Nelson McCausland of the DUP when he was writing a piece in which he claimed that the BBC shouldn't employ me. But yeah, I was born, my parents were both school teachers, and they were both of them came from fairly staunch working class backgrounds, but both of them had kind of gone to college and stuff, and they were changing, they were sort of transitioning into being, they would have been like quite sympathetic to the civil rights movement, but cautiously so, because we lived in a very loyalist area. And but when I started going to school, I was immediately drawn to the whole sort of Irish music scene and Christy Moore and Planxty and all of that, which involved then going into the Republican part of Derry. And so I started to sort of move out of my own community at quite a young age. But also, my father would have given me Seamus Heaney's poetry books as they came out. And I think that he did that partly because he loved Heaney's use of rural County Derry language, which my father also used, and we would laugh at him when he used these words. So I think he wanted us to see that this language had a proud sort of history.
It gave it a sort of a legitimacy.
So we weren't brought up in a very purist Protestant way.
But going back a generation, I know I think your maternal grandfather was an Orange man?
Yeah, he was a real proud wee Orange man, and had the whole set of beliefs about that if you looked up to your betters, they would look after you. And sure enough, he got a house in the White City estate in Dungannon, and that was I realised when I started writing about Protestantism that was how you were meant to be. The whole Orange system relies upon that thing of looking up to your betters and knowing your place.
And the sense that one identity was sufficient to do you, that, you didn't need a socialist identity, because if you were in the Orange Order, the natural order of things would be that, that would be your advantage that you required, in other words, to advance, to get a job, to get a house and so forth.
And above all, there was to be no solidarity with Catholics.
Tell us then how your career developed. Then you came down to Trinity. I guess.
I got a scholarship to Trinity and left the North in 1975, thinking I never ever wanted to go back there. I just fled the place, And when
that was the year that Heaney came south as well.
I don't know.
Possibly.
But anyway, came to Trinity and sort of just was completely bewildered. Like, for example, part of my scholarship was that I got Commons, which is the formal dinner in Trinity every evening.
Free meals.
And I just couldn't. I had no ability to handle the class aspect of that. I didn't know how to behave in that kind of setting. I was completely at sea. And I found Dublin quite bewildering. I felt that, I'd no way of exploring my identity as part of anything that was available to me in Dublin. I was surrounded by people who had very strong opinions about the North and didn't seem to need to ask Northerners what they thought. So anyway, I ended up going back to Belfast in 1981 in a kind of probably deliberate effort to find out my own place in society. And when I got to Belfast, I discovered that it was so much fiercer a place than Dublin. I found Belfast quite a terrifying place. 1981, it was just after the hunger strikes, and so I ended up, I couldn't identify with any political party there, but I did feel the need to be politically active, so that was when I got involved in working with some other women to set up the Belfast Rape Crisis Centre, and that became, my feminism really became the sort of plank of everything that I've done since.
And I'm imagining that in those circles, feminism was, a much more important identifying common ground, if you like, rather than whether you're from a orange or green background.
Well, no, it wasn't. It was completely contested all the time. Everybody fought with each other all the time, and there was all this stuff about you can't be a unionist and be a feminist. You can't be a Republican and not be a feminist, and You know, if you're a feminist, you have to support the women on the hunger strikes in Armagh jail and stuff. And no, it was quite ferocious, really quite ferocious. And
tell us how you got into journalism then.
well, I worked in the Rape Crisis Centre for a good while, and then I went down to Sligo and ran a centre for young unemployed people there. And then my friend Trish Hegarty said that I should become a journalist, and I thought, well, that's good. It's the first piece of career advice I've ever had. So I did do that. I did the Dublin City University course for a year, which was quite strange because I was a good bit older than anybody else on the course and felt very worldly wise. But I mean, in fact, I was only 30, but I felt very old. And then I was employed in the Irish Press, and then Vincent Browne gave me my break when he employed me in the Tribune. And I quickly started doing, you know, social affairs stuff there, and then the Northern stuff, and then I took over from Ed Maloney when he left. And I suppose I kind of transformed the way that the Tribune covered the North, because Ed had obviously covered it during the conflict years primarily, whereas I was coming in at the end of the conflict, the beginning of the peace process. So it was a period of transition, and I started bringing in stuff like coverage of social issues and violence against women and that kind of thing, and cultural stuff.
And maybe more on the human cost of the troubles, maybe you know, survivor stories or victim stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think my background as having trained as a counsellor was a big help when it came to being a journalist, because it sort of, you're very aware of how the way that people ask people questions can in itself be quite traumatizing. So it was good to have that skill going into journalism, especially when working with people who've had horrendous experiences.
Can we move on now to the two books then? So firstly, Northern Protestants and Unsettled People, like that came out in the year 2000, I think.
Yeah.
So the timing of that then, was that sort of, was your thinking, you've just had the Good Friday Agreement, which is maybe, you know, a full stop to the troubles, now is a good time to take stock, or what else was?
Yeah, well, it was that, and it was the beginning of a new era, and it just seemed so momentous. But I think it was also because, having been working in the Sunday Tribune, I was very aware that a lot of people in the Republic just didn't know enough about the North, and in particular didn't know very much about the Protestant community in the North. You know, they would have been aware of Paisley, obviously, as this monstrous, negative demagogue figure, but not of the diversity that was there in that community. And I just felt that it would be interesting to sort of present that. But primarily, yes, it's about the transition from the conflict into the peace process and out the other side of the Good Friday Agreement.
And I guess when you're putting together, you know, a kaleidoscopic portrait of a community, a big question is always, how do you choose who to include, who to leave out? Obviously, from a journalistic point of view, you're going to gravitate towards interesting stories, people, you know, who have got a story to tell, but equally, you know, you've got to be mindful, I imagine, of reflecting the community in all its diversity.
Yeah, well, in this first book, my thinking was that I should try to broadly represent the ways in which opinions were held in the North. So therefore, there is a predominance in this of unionist people, because the majority of people at that stage would have been voting unionist. That has changed a great deal since, and I changed my own approach there. But in this book, I sort of went for particular, you know yourself, being from where you're from, Martin, that in the North, like, where you're from is hugely important to your experience of everything. You know, if somebody has been killed in your area, then that creates a particular sort of atmosphere and story in your community or your part of the community, and it affects the relationship of one community to another and all of that. So I divided it up into sort of places, like I did a chapter about Portadown, because at that stage Drumcree was on, the Drumcree protests, which were sort of a last-ditch attempt to defeat the Good Friday Agreement. And there's still relics of Drumcree going on in the north, amazingly, all these years later. In fact, it's enjoying a bit of a resurgence at the moment. So Portadown, I spent a lot of time at Drumcree listening to what was being said there in the crowds, because often it's what's being said in the crowd that's
Not for public
interesting rather than
consumption.
what's coming from the platform.
Yeah.
And then other places that I went to were, the border, because obviously the border is always important when you're writing about the north. It's such a sort of trouble zone, really, in its own quiet way. And then Derry, because obviously being from Derry, I think it's the centre of the universe. And, it features in the second book as well. So that book was very much organised around particular places and their particular history.
I want to sort of conclude with the first book before moving on to the second one. But again, the way that the second book is ordered, it's broken up geographically with maybe different areas. And I guess yes, like I remember going to university and as a Catholic from Banbridge in County Down, and going to university meeting some Catholic fellow student from Oma in Tyrone, and just a completely different experience. And was the whole sort of west of the Ban being predominantly Catholic, and therefore if you're from an area where your community is in the majority, it's a completely different experience to maybe growing up somewhere where you're very much the minority. So I'm imagining there definitely is no sense that the north is a homogenous place.
No,
it's
by no
not only
means.
divided, but equally different areas have got a completely different feel, far beyond just the colour of the paving stones or the flags that might fly there. Could we ask, 20 years on, before we go on to that, could I say, did you, in doing the first book, did it kind of, confirm your own understanding of a place that you already knew pretty well? Or in doing it, did you yourself learn lessons?
No, I learned a huge amount from doing that book, because I just talked to so many people, and I learned a lot about my own sense of where I was in the community. And the phrase that I used in relation to it was, the people I uneasily call my own, because I realised that to a great extent I was formed and I was part of the Protestant community in the north, but I also felt I'd travelled a very long way from it.
But not rejecting it entirely, or not?
No, by no means
it.
rejecting it.
Yeah.
I mean, when the book came out, I was accused, of course, of being a Lundy and a traitor, because I had been critical, and that's the big problem in unionism, and it's why Lundy is on the cover of the new book. It's this thing of, that if you stray off the narrow path of what is supposed to be unionist belief, you're a traitor.
Yes, and also maybe betraying from within, sort of telling secrets out of school.
Yeah.
Not perhaps that the fact that there's a sectarian strand to Protestant identity in the north is a huge secret, but maybe like Newton Emerson, I think in his review, referred to the fact that it was almost like something that was unspoken, or certainly in the mainstream media was maybe glossed over. It wasn't sort of parsed or examined. And it reminded me a little bit of the famous John Waters interview with Charles Haughey in Hot Press, where he included every expletive that Haughey uttered, which would not have made any other coverage, whereas you faithfully recorded exactly what people said and thought.
And actually some people, I was contacted by some people afterwards who said that they found that liberating, the acknowledgement of sectarianism. They found it liberating because they were struggling with it themselves in whatever part of their community they were living in, that they liked it being acknowledged in that way. It kind of brought it out into the open.
Yeah, opening the windows. So if we can now move on to the new book then, which has got a similar but slightly different title, Northern Protestants on Shifting Ground. So it feels to me almost that, there's always unsettling or shifting, whatever there's change it seems to be a constant. It seems to be a community that maybe always feels that the status quo is not being sustained, that their institutions are under threat from,
Yeah.
say, the fall of Stormont in 71 to, the loss of a unionist majority, to the Good Friday Agreement, maybe sort of political changes that they don't uphold, demographic changes that they're uncomfortable with. So, first question.
Well, that's kind of all the answers.
Sorry, asked and answered, as they say in American courtroom dramas. So why go back 20 years on? Why now?
Well, people have been saying to me over the years, you should do another edition of it, and it sort of, the time never seemed right. And then with the centenary of Northern Ireland coming up, and also the whole sort of absolute drama of the fact that unionism no longer has a majority at Stormont, which is just, I don't know if people in the Republic have any sense of how momentous that is, and how unsettling unionism is finding it. So, and then just the demographic change as well. It's now the case that it's only in the over 70s or 60s or 70s that there is actually now a Protestant majority. And if you look at the fact that, say, if you look at the question of a united Ireland, something like 50% of under 45-year-olds from the whole community now support unification of Ireland in the north. Like, that's so different from if you looked at that, say, in the over 60s, it would be a very, very different picture. So the north is changing dramatically. It's actually changing much more dramatically than I knew when I started the book. I took the title from something that the poet Jean Blakeney said to me. We went for a walk along the Fermanagh border. Her father was a customs man along there, and she told me that she had been one of what she called the panicked surge of Protestants who voted for the DUP in 2017, having never been a DUP voter. And she said, I felt the ground that the ground was shifting, and that unionism needed to steady itself, but it then started to become very, very shifting. It reminded me of last year. I remember seeing this thing on television of a piece of a bog that had broken off somewhere in a river, or somewhere up about Castledurg, I think, and it was just, this piece of land was flying down the middle of this river, and the north has become like that. It's changing very, very quickly at the moment, and I think that's reflected in the sense of panic that you see in the unionist political groups.
So one thing that struck me, maybe the main thing that struck me reading a fascinating book, again, I'm from there, but I haven't lived there for quite some time, and even though I try to keep as informed and engaged as I can, it was definitely eye-opening to me to sort of, again, see that kaleidoscope of so many different people's experiences. I guess my key takeaway was it's a book not about identity, but about identities in the plural, that no longer is there this sort of dominant theme of, I'm from a Protestant background, I am Northern Irish or British or both, I'm a unionist or a loyalist or whatever. Now there are so many more ways of identifying, whether it be feminist or socialist or environmentalist or globalist or, or whatever. So
yeah, it's changed enormously, and in fact, a couple of people have said to me, would you write a third Northern Protestants? But if I left another 20 years, that would put me in my 80s. So I'm hoping hoping that even as a self-employed person, I might be able to retire by that stage. But it's ask me the question again. I can't remember what it was.
I hope it wasn't another of those statements, masculine. We usually save those to the end.
The changing identities. Yeah, I actually felt, no, I wouldn't probably do a third book because I felt a little bit sectarian asking people to be Protestants for me, or I felt that I was imposing a binary on Northern Irish society which is no longer appropriate. And I think it is an aspect of, it's a really, really good sign of the liberation which has taken place because of the Good Friday Agreement, that an awful lot of people were willing to talk to me this time around in a way that they weren't the last time, about being not a practicing Protestant or in a mixed relationship or from parents who were from different relationships. You know, there was just a whole change and a much more fluidity. And I think that binary thing of the Protestant, the two communities, the twin communities frozen in basalt or whatever that John Montague calls them, you know, that's really broken down quite a lot, and it's a really, really good thing.
I think I remember you saying that you got to know and become friends with Lear McKay, the journalist who was tragically murdered in Derry 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And after a while, it gradually dawned on you that actually you'd presumed that she was from a Protestant background for whatever reason, and then, you know, discovered that actually she was, you know, largely from a Catholic background, and that was actually kind of pleasing to you.
Yeah, I was delighted by that because, like, you know, from being from where you're from and of a certain vintage as well, that you, in the Troubles, everybody would keep an eye on everybody else, and you'd always want to know where you were with people, which generally speaking was this horrible reflex to find out, is this a Catholic or a Protestant, you know? And there was all sorts of ways of doing it, and one of the people that I was speaking to about this was Scott McKendry, who's a poet from the Shankill in Belfast. And Scott said that his father worked in the shipyards, and one of his colleagues told him that you could always tell by the back of someone's neck whether they were one or the other, you know.
Dear God.
But when I realised that I hadn't done that in relation to Lyra, I felt so free, you know, because and it's something that younger people don't do now.
Yeah.
Like I interviewed some people in that book. A really lovely young woman called Rebecca Crockett, for example, in Derry, who's only 18, and she was quite offended at the idea that you would want to know what religion your friends were. She couldn't understand why I was even asking her about it, you know. And I think that's fantastic.
There was another thing that I read. I'm not sure it was in the book or just recently about how public transport can make a difference, and there are these new sort of, you know, routes established in Belfast buses and gliders, and there was a depressing controversy over whether it was going to go up as the Antrim Road or some other, a Catholic road or a Protestant road, basically, which is depressing. But more positively, I was reading that, you know, young people from East Belfast were now confident or comfortable enough to, you know, go to West Belfast for a music festival or even to drink in the park or whatever.
Yeah. Well, there's are you saying that drinking in parks is a good lifestyle for young people?
In the current climate, it's got a lot to be said for.
Yeah, no. One of a person that I interviewed who I found very, very interesting in Derry was Kenny McFarland, who's the chairperson of the Londonderry Bands Forum.
Yeah.
And he's one of the Derry people who, as a child, kind of got put out of Derry City. At a certain stage, he was living on the edge of the Bogside with his Protestant family, and there was a lot of trouble and hassle, and eventually they just moved out to a place called New Buildings, which he described as basically being like a kind of internment camp for Protestants. But he got involved in the whole loyalist band scene, and he talked about how bands are generally seen in this very negative sectarian light, but actually he said it's a really good way for a working class kid to learn a musical instrument. And he talked about how his kids and their friends now are in the loyalist bands. They learn how to play the flute or the drum or whatever, and then they come home in the evening from work and they go out to the bars in Waterloo Street and listen to the Irish music there. And I thought that's so different from when I was at school, when it was a real thing to be going. You had to go through an army checkpoint to go to those bars in Waterloo Street, and it was really transgressive to be doing that. And but it's all, he said, the phrase that he actually used was, "We want normal politics." And an interesting thing happened in Derry as well, and I think it was in 2013 when the All-Ireland FLA was held in the city, and they, the people who were organising it decided that they were going to try to include the loyalist bands and the Protestant choirs and everything in the FLA. And Kenny said, so they came to us and they said, "Would you do this?" And he said to his committee, "They'll expect us to say no. What if we say yes?" You know, and they did say yes, and it was fantastic, and people really loved it, and it was a very healing thing.
I'm thinking, I can't remember where it was from, but you know, there's a wonderful sort of musical performance where they had Lambeg drums and Byrons all in the same sort of musical arrangement. The idea being that, you know, the two traditions can not only live side by side, but actually occasionally at least coalesce.
Well, I think it's like what you said earlier about the question of minorities. I think that, you know, Bernadette Devlin famously dubbed Derry as the capital city of injustice because of the way that the city council was gerrymandered so that there was always going to be a unionist majority. But it is actually now a unionist minority city in the normal way, and unionists no longer dominate the council and everything. But there is a more mannerly relationship now between the unionist community and the nationalist community in Derry, and a huge amount of work went into that. And I suppose you'd have to say as well, Martin McGuinness played quite a considerable part in that, because he behaved in quite a statesmanly way between the communities there, and he was very supportive of the band community, for example.
Yeah, and by reaching out, by building bridges, whatever, by creating a space. Yes. It's interesting you mentioned Scott McKendry there, the poet in Belfast. Like, I read a brilliant essay by him on the area of East Belfast off the Shankill Road, the Hammer.
West Belfast.
West Belfast. And it was just a really brilliant portrait of a community which suffered terrible social deprivation and been kind of broken up by not just violence, but also kind of supposed regeneration, which actually broke up communities of terraced houses into these awful sounding tower blocks, whatever, which became like a magnet for social problems and deprivation above and beyond paramilitarism. But I guess I wanted to say there's quite a few writers mentioned in your book, or that you interview in the book. For example, Jan Carson, who's written, you know, one of the best books to come out of novels to come out of the North in recent years, The Firestarters, which is shortlisted for 2 big prizes in France in the last couple of months, the French translation. Would you like to say a little bit, like, obviously there's been a long tradition of great writing from the Protestant tradition in the North, Sam Hannah Bell and so forth, Mary Jones, and in the 80s and 90s perhaps, but to my mind anyway, there seems to be a bit of a flowering of great writing from that's coming out of the, you know, people of a Protestant background in the North. I'm thinking of Jan, but also Lucy Caldwell, Wendy Erskine, Rosemary Jenkinson, maybe even Angeline King writing in Ulster Scots. Would you like to say a little about that? Or?
I mean, to my mind, the great poet of the Protestant imagination in the North is Derek Mahon, but he's not often seen as such, partly because he was so angry with the North and so angry with the whole unionist community, and he did an interview with Paul Durkin in McGill in the 1980s, I think it was, in which he just excoriates unionism. And it's a really, really intemperate, interesting article. But yeah, I think there is an absolute renaissance of in the arts in the North at the moment, and it's being led by young women. And all of the people that you mentioned, but also a young woman called Stacey Gregg, who I think it's like, you know, the way when a marsh or something has been polluted and all the wild birds have left and things, and it's just a piece of wasteland, and then something is done, something changes, and these exotic birds start coming back again. And to me, Stacey Gregg is like a sign of that things must be sort of okay in many ways in the North, because she's an absolutely brilliant young playwright from East Belfast, outer East Belfast. And she went off to college she went to Cambridge, and like me in Trinity, was just completely bewildered. She said she got into a lot of trouble, and she was called in by her tutor one day, and the tutor said, "Couldn't you go off to some friends in Paris for a few weeks?" You know, and she sort of thought, well, this just isn't my world at all, you know. But she became this very eclectic playwright, and she's come back to Northern Ireland now with, you know, garlanded with awards from all over the world, and she's living with her wife and their little child in Bangor, County Down, you know, perfectly comfortably, perfectly at ease with being there. Her wife is from Essex and wanted a view of the sea, you know, so I think it's really great to see that happening. It's sort of like, in my generation, people who didn't fit in left.
And didn't come back.
And went and tormented people all over the world with their unhappiness, you know, about not being home, you know, but whereas now, like I might read a little bit from her, actually.
That'd be lovely.
She uses a great verb about Northern Ireland, which I hope will be in this bit. Yeah. This little chapter, the book is in sort of quite small little chapters, which I think makes it quite easy to read, doesn't it? Because you can just pick and choose bits of it.
For sure.
But this piece is called Emancipating Myself from Restrictions Arising from Shame. She launched herself as a furious and utterly original dramatic artist in England, got some of her best breaks in the Republic of Ireland, and is now back in Northern Ireland, where she has just made her first feature film and has currently another one shooting. Stacey Gregg is a restless iconoclast, perched for now with her wife and child in Bangor on the North Down coast, but holding on to their flat in London just in case they want to leave again. I'm an Irish playwright who's at home in London, Dublin and Belfast. A lot of my identity has straddled binaries, gender, nationality, class, she said. I'm comfortable with that. I pursue it. I'm happiest in the in-between places. 2020 is a terrible year to have made a film, but it was an absolute blast. It's a psychological drama and a contemporary ghost story set in Belfast. I've never stopped trying to write about my Northern Irishness. Having lived in groovy parts of London and Brighton, it's hard to deal with the aggression about gender that persists here, she said. You can't grow up here and not be political. I'm very aware that Protestants don't get a good rap. I feel uneasy when people mock working-class Protestants. It shows a poverty of empathy. There's a flavour of condescension. I find value in being from a people who were seen as the oppressor in the relationship. It's uncomfortable, and I feel it's a moral duty to understand that discomfort. There is transformation afoot, she senses. Northern Ireland has unclenched somewhat. Young people are just more respectful and open. Attitudes to consent really have changed. That suits her. I've been emancipating myself from restrictions arising from shame. Digital natives have access to ideas that go far beyond those imparted by the traditional cultural sources that informed their parents' imaginations, she said. There is a fluidity to their sense of persona and identity. I think that's really, really important, what she says there, and I found it to be the case. You know, there are so many young people now in the North from all communities who don't vote, aren't particularly concerned about the constitutional question, but they are very political. And some of them look to the Republic and see how, you know, same-sex marriage and abortion rights were introduced here, not by politicians, but by mass movements, civil society movements. And they're encouraged by that in the Northern context. It's really hard in the North because politics is really obdurate in the North, but they are trying it. And they're interested in things like, you know, global climate justice and climate change, and you know, they're not so tied to the whole notion of what it is to be Northern Irish.
Is just on that question of identity, I guess, so I think you're right that it isn't, you know, the first thing that people necessarily think of when they wake up in the morning, you know, I'm Irish, or I'm British, or I'm Northern Irish. But maybe for you yourself, I guess, you know, you've lived down here for quite some time, but would you, I think I've heard you describe yourself as both Irish and Northern Irish.
Yeah, I've adopted this kind of James Bondian notion of Irish, Northern Irish. You know, because I would say my husband and children are Irish. You know, our girls grew up here in Dublin. My husband is from Wales, but from an Irish background, and quite staunch about being Irish in a way that I wouldn't be. But glad he's not here.
Interesting you use staunch.
He wouldn't approve of me saying that. But I definitely feel that I have an identity which isn't that of the mainstream here. You know, like I have my radio tuned into BBC Northern Ireland all the time, and my husband comes into the room and changes it to RTE, and so it goes, you know. But there's definitely a thing about being from Northern Ireland. There is an anguish to being from Northern Ireland, and you know, I don't see that ending, because like it's really difficult in the north at the moment. It's quite a volatile moment, and you sometimes feel, do people here realise that? You know, do people realise that the DUP is moving very, very close to explicitly saying that it no longer supports the Good Friday Agreement? You know, these things are happening north of the border, and they're not really very much discussed down here. So in answer to your question, I think I see myself as Northern Irish, but I don't particularly like that denomination on its own. So Irish, Northern Irish.
But it is fascinating, the variety of identities again, or the different layers, whatever, and even how people, sometimes for their own devices when they're trying to add up a majority in favour of United Ireland from opinion polls. Northern Irish, you might think, is sort of secessionist, or it certainly doesn't say to me. It doesn't shout out to me pro-United Ireland.
No.
It's it's a separate identity. And then some people see themselves as Northern Irish and British. Other people see themselves as, Northern Irish, but maybe identifying more with Ireland. Rosemary Jenkinson, the writer, coined the term Brit-Irish to sum up her own identity. I guess, how can I put this then? Some people will sort of, Colm Tóibín, for example, recently in an article in The Guardian, there are a couple of comments which I think provoked a lot of upset, maybe north of the border. Basically, I think he said something that, did people down here want to import or didn't want to import sectarian hatreds from the north? I think part of
and
the pushback...
perpetual culture of perpetual grievance.
That as well.
Also said, yeah.
No, I think maybe part of the pushback to that was, he was quoting from his own book, which he certainly researched in 1986, A Walk Along the Border. And it kind of felt that, maybe unlike yourself, he hasn't done a follow-up. He hasn't maybe, what he's writing about is something, he's writing with the past maybe, and it doesn't chime with.
No, I think
it
didn't reflect well on him. It was very ignorant what he said, and very out of touch with how things actually are. And I wouldn't personally want to be identifying myself with Michael McDowell in the way that he did. He sort of this warning about the spectre of Sinn Féin. I mean, you can be politically opposed to Sinn Féin, but you have to acknowledge that they are a popular party, both north and south of the border. And you can't dismiss all of the people who vote for them in the way that he tried to do. And it really rankled with me, the notion that somehow we are attached in the north to our sectarian culture, because sectarianism is an affliction in the north, and I personally have come to feel that it can't be resolved in the context of Northern Ireland. I think the northern state is coming to an end. I don't think it can work, because I don't think that unionism has had the generosity of imagination to share Northern Ireland. They needed to make it an attractive place for the other nationalist community to live in, and they haven't done that. And it has recently emerged that there's an unwillingness to accept that under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, the next First Minister might be from Sinn Féin, which is just a complete sort of betrayal of the notion of the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, the executive office, which used to be known as OFM, DFM, Office of the First and Deputy First Ministers, it's a shared office. The First and Deputy First Ministers are equal roles. They're badly named, I think, but they are equal roles. So the notion that somehow or other unionism has persisted with the myth that they are still the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland because they have the First Ministry, and they cannot tolerate symbolically the notion of the other being the First Minister. It's a very, very bad sign of how rooted the Good Friday Agreement is in political unionism, but I think it is in the community. That's the thing, and that's why I think that there's a lot of hope in Northern Ireland, but it's not really reflected in the way that unionist politics is behaving.
I think I would say obviously the North has been blighted by sectarianism, but to just sort of leave that as a kind of a blanket thing, the North is defined by that sectarianism, or everyone in the North is tainted somehow by sectarian attitudes, that is kind of quite offensive, or it's certainly
It was
untrue.
very offensive, but it was obviously, Colin Tabine is now a wealthy internationalist. I read an interview with him in the New Yorker the other day, in which he was talking about his 4 homes all over the world, and one of them wasn't in Ballymena, let's put it that way. And
his loss.
His loss, yeah. But, he doesn't know what he's talking about, and I think a lot of otherwise quite politically astute people in the Republic, I don't think they really understand how seismic the Good Friday Agreement was, or its ambitions. The ambition for peace and reconciliation, and the architecture that it put in place between the islands and between North and South. I don't think people grasp that here.
Or the great work that people have been putting in on the ground. Like, I was in Belfast for a couple of days during the week, and I was in a room with people from, neighbouring communities in North Belfast, working in community relations or peace building or whatever, and they knew each other and they worked alongside each other, and they were kind of, when things were maybe hot and heavy in the summer with some of the protests, there are a lot of people on the ground that are working to kind of defuse situations and build bridges and build understanding. There was another guy in the room who worked for a loyalist community organisation in South Londonderry or whatever, but as he described it, and but again, he was talking about working with people from the other community. So I think, there are different ways of understanding the North, but to kind of portray it as as what could have been the former Yugoslavia, that was, it was never the case, and there were always a lot of people on both sides who weren't sectarian and who basically kept the fabric of the place together.
Well, also, if you think about things like the thing that has happened recently with the British government announcing that they're going to introduce an amnesty and they're going to draw a line under the past, and that there's not going to be any further investigations. And then you think about what happened either yesterday or the day before, when that new report came out about the Omagh bomb, with further evidence that bomb could perhaps have been prevented. That's our history. We need to know our history. There's something profoundly anti-historical about the notion that you can just write off the Troubles. I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of murders were unsolved, and there were structures set up under the Stormont House Agreement which could have helped to find a way around that. There's probably not going to be very many more prosecutions because the evidence doesn't exist, or people are too old, or the principals are dead. But there are lots of other ways that the truth could be found within properly set up structures. And the government said that it was going to introduce that within 100 days of the resumption of the executive in 2020. And then it was just abandoned. And the next thing we hear is there's going to be an amnesty. I mean, obviously people are going to complain about that. And if that's, what he's talking about is a culture of grievance, I mean, there is grievance there. There's grievance among people who have been left with the awfulness of having somebody in their family described, say, as being a paramilitary when they weren't, or that they had been involved in something that they weren't, or who killed them, or why did they kill them, or who told them to kill them. Of course those people are going to have a sense of grievance.
Obviously, your book very much focuses on the Protestant community in the North, but there's the other side of the coin, if you like, which is the Catholic community and how it has changed. Like Fionnuala O'Connor wrote a very good book, I think, In Search of a State, published by Blackstaff in the early 90s. Like, whilst researching this, did you have a kind of a weather eye and sort of seeing, what was happening in the Catholic community, or how it has maybe changed? Has it, would you say, liberalised and secularised in a similar way or at a similar pace?
I think that there are a lot of differences, and I think that the Protestant community is beginning to realise that there are problems about confidence in the Protestant community that have to do with not being community-minded in the same way that the Catholic community has been over the years. You know, that you look at the GAA, the Catholic Church, you know, the schools, Irish language. You know, there are various things that the Catholic community has kind of built into the fabric of its sense of itself, you know. Whereas within the Unionist community, a lot of people you know, they'll say it's our culture, and you sort of sense, well, they mean the 12th, but what else do they mean? Because they don't mean Stacey Gregg, you know, they don't mean Derek Mahon. They have quite a narrow version of what their culture is, you know, and you as a reporter over the years in the North, I would have gone to lots and lots of public meetings in community halls all over the place, you know, wee tiny villages and small towns and in Belfast, you know, and they're generally Catholic, they're generally nationalist, they're often Republican. They're also sometimes organised by local councils who invite Unionists to take part, and then the Unionists don't come, you know, so there's an ability to talk and debate and hold your own in a conversation that exists in a lot of Catholic people from a Catholic background that doesn't exist in the Protestant community, and that needs to change, because then it just creates this anger. People just get angry because they can't express themselves.
Did you find any pushback when you were looking for people to interview for this book, to, you know, to get that balance? Like, most of the reviews of the book have been extremely positive, and not all from, you know, necessarily people who would be, you know, from a nationalist background or whatever. For example, you know, Kevin Meyer's review in the Irish Independent was extremely enthusiastic and full of praise. Like, the sole one that I came across that was critical was by Henry MacDonald, and he said there were far too many Lundies in the book and far too few apprentices, by which he meant there was an imbalance of you know, people who were sort of moving beyond the traditional Protestant Unionist identity, and too few of say ones who would you would identify as being similar to the politicians that the community largely has elected, say in the DUP. What would you say to that criticism?
Well, I don't think that it's true. I mean, I think that I deliberately did in this book go looking for alternative voices, because it really annoys me how few voices are still heard in the Republic, in particular from the North. You know, even if somebody is doing a piece about the Protestant community, it seems like there's about half a dozen people, 5 of them men, who get asked to talk, you know. And there was that report that senator did down here about Protestant opinion, and it was just like nearly all men and nearly all from a very particular sort of unionist background.
The usual suspects.
Yeah, and so I was deliberately looking for those people, but it was, I mean, that review was really weird, because he talked about a particular person in it who's actually in the book and who is a really fantastic person. He's Kyle Black. He's the son of a prison officer who was murdered relatively recently by dissident Republicans, and he's a really, really thoughtful anti-sectarian person, and he's a DUP councillor, and he's talking about how he believes that the DUP needs to change, and he obviously feels that he can bring change within that party. Now, plenty of people would argue with him that he's not going to succeed, but he's a very, very honourable person. And he was pleased to be in the book, and you know, we talked a lot before he did the interview, and he was happy with the interview, and he thanked me for including the interview. So then it's quite strange to find yourself being attacked in a review.
Plus there are several, like Willie Fraser from South Armagh, there's a hardline unionist preacher from South Armagh,
Yeah, there's lots of
Roy Begg, Sammy Wilson.
Yeah, there's a very broad representation of people in the book. I mean, I think that review was more just sort of like, there was a good book to be written about Protestants, and this wasn't it. And that the book that should have been written by me. You know, I think that was basically what the subplot of that particular review was. But in relation to your question about the Catholic side of things, Martin, I couldn't write that sort of book myself, because I know Protestantism in my bones. You know, I grew up with it. I know I have all the sectarian reflexes. I have to quash them all the time, you know, and I couldn't do that. I'm not steeped in the Protestant community, but I would love to see somebody do something like that, bearing in mind also what I said earlier, though, about not particularly liking that binary thing.
Sure,
but there is something interesting to be written there.
You might well have an opinion, though, about how nationalism or its political representatives can work towards making the North a better place or building reconciliation. Like Sinn Féin is obviously on the rise down here, might very well be in government down here. But they've come in for quite a lot of criticism for, you know, maybe their, you know, how they commemorate what they, you know, their tradition. They're celebrating hunger strikers and the dead of the IRA. How does that fit in, would you say, with the need for reconciliation, for building bridges, both in the North and in the context of, you know, of working positively and progressively towards a united Ireland in which people from a Protestant background in the North would feel welcome?
What a huge question. Well, I think that there is a real problem about commemoration in the North because it is offensive to people when someone is commemorated as a hero who killed your father. You know, I mean, the awful intimacy of the North is really what was involved in that book, Bear in Mind These Dead, you know, where you've, and just as an example of, I heard people reacting when Brandon Lewis, the Secretary of State, was talking about this amnesty. And there's a woman who I heard talking, and she's somebody that I know. I've interviewed her, and her husband was a part-time UDR man who was visiting her in hospital in Mid-Ulster when she had just had their first baby. And the IRA staked him out in the car park of the maternity wing. And he had just come in to see his new baby, and when he came out of the building, he was shot dead, and she was there with the baby and heard the shots, you know. And that man actually did do his time. He was convicted, that killer. And but she said that since he got out under the Good Friday Agreement, he drives about the town and honks the horn at her and waves at her and makes faces at her and things. And you know, a lot of people were sort of saying, well, that's going to happen all over the place if we get this amnesty, because then there is a bit of manners is put on people by the prospect that they could potentially be still prosecuted. Whereas if you had the amnesty, then there's going to be a lot of killers walking around feeling quite jaunty about themselves. But yeah, I mean, there's been things like the infamous naming of the swing park after after a hunger striker. And there's
the Kings Mill incident where was it a Sinn Féin councillor, you know, posted a photograph of himself with a loaf of King's Mill's bread on his head, which is obviously the name of a massacre in which 10 Protestant workmen were shot dead. So work to do.
Well, I guess from a legal point of view, it needs to be said that he did apologise for that and said that he hadn't meant it, but it was an appalling incident, and if he hadn't thought about it, he bloody well should have thought about it. But no, there's offence caused all around by the way that the dead are commemorated in the North, and it's very, very problematic. And it's, you know, from the war memorials to, I mean, some people from the local security forces are offended because their names are not put up on war memorials. And on the other hand, other people find war memorials offensive because
they're only for people in uniform.
Yeah, and so it's problematic historically, and it's problematic going on. Like in Fermanagh, I've noticed recently there's all these little plaques at the side of the road showing a little IRA gunman, and it's sort of where a certain volunteer was killed or whatever, and that's so offensive to, you know, people from the Protestant community along the border who were killed by the IRA. But it's really very difficult for that to be resolved, and it needs to be done in some sort of communal agreed way. But one of the things that I think is quite hopeful in connection with my book is that I do feel that it has entered into a kind of discussion about these things, because there was a review by the Sinn Féin's American representative, I think his name is Kieran Quinn, And when I saw it, I must admit I braced myself for being patronised. But in fact, it was a very thoughtful review. And he said that my book challenges the IRA and Sinn Féin to face up to the hurt that was caused in the Protestant community and the lingering pain that is still experienced by people because of the IRA campaign. Like, for example, there's an interview in the book with two sisters whose parents were killed in the Enniskillen bomb, and they've never had justice. They've never found out who did that and everything. So, and he took that on board. You know, he didn't do the traditional sort of, well, there was wrong on both sides and awful things happen in war, you know, which has been a formula that has been used too often.
And the insistence that the IRA campaign was not sectarian because they shot Catholic or UC men as well as Protestant ones. The uniform they were targeting rather than the community. I mean,
there definitely was a very strong element of sectarianism in the IRA campaign, and that has got to be faced. And up to now, there's been an unwillingness to face that. But what is King's Mills? What is the Shankill bomb of 1990, if not sectarian?
I know we're running out of time. There's just one question one aspect of the book that I wanted to advert to, and that was, you know, the sort of dissenting tradition, if you like, within Protestantism, by which I mean that, you know, Protestantism in the North was not always, you know, associated with unionism and loyalism, but say in 1798 there was the United Irishmen, which is, you know, a tradition which was largely led by Presbyterian community in the North, and that's a tradition which is now being re-explored or reconnected with by some people from a Protestant background in the North. I'm thinking of Claire Mitchell, who reviewed your book for the Irish Times and who's bringing out her own book next year. And then that would lead forward to, say, people who were termed rotten prods by the Protestant unionist community themselves, people who were maybe of a socialist or maybe even communist background at the time of when Catholics were being driven out of the shipyards around the first troubles around partition. They were also driven from work, and then maybe leading on even until the 1930s and where the working class communities from during the Depression came together in protests for fair conditions for the poor. We'd just like to say something just very quickly about that aspect. That
I mean, there always has been a radical tradition, and it's still going on. I think if you look at something that's sort of quite simple in a way, Linda Irvine's work on the Irish language. Linda is from a communist background, and she is running these Irish classes, and they're entirely a good thing, not least because a lot of the adults who are taking up the Irish language in the Protestant community are early school leavers or people who didn't do well in the conventional education system, and then some of them are going on into third level and so on. So it's a completely sort of building community confidence project, but it's being attacked by elements of loyalism that feel that it's sort of like a Trojan horse for republicanism in their area. You know, so it's too easy still to be called a traitor in the Protestant community. You know, I'm personally a little bit disappointed I was never called a rotten prod. You know, it has a ring to
Give it time.
Doesn't it?
Give it time. Okay, speaking of time, I think we've probably overrun. So I'm now going to open it up to questions from the audience. Bert, are you going to?
Yeah, if you just want to raise your hand, and you have to come to the microphone, the nearest microphone. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. Okay. That lady there, just look at the middle microphone.
Thanks very much for the discussion. It's been fascinating. My first time in Belfast 30 years ago, the only Indian restaurant I could find was run by a guy with a ginger beard and an Ulster accent. And we've been up to the wee north 3 or 4 times since we immigrated here 2 years ago. And we went on the walking tour of the Catholic part to the Protestant part, where you go through the gate. And I noticed that there were ethnic restaurants on both sides, and that there were a lot of people of color all over Belfast. And I just wondered if you could comment on the introduction of people from other countries and how that has helped to dilute this binary phenomenon that you talked about earlier.
Yeah, there are a lot of, well, there's not a lot. There's a growing small minority of people from other countries and cultures in Northern Ireland, and you will see them in those areas because they tend to be given public housing in some of the poorest parts of Northern Ireland, like West Belfast where the Peace Line is. There's always empty houses available around the Peace Lines for kind of obvious reasons. But there was an incident which I write about in the book where just about 6 months ago the Multicultural Centre in Donegal Pass was burned down, and it was at that time that it was burned down. It was actually being used to distribute food and food parcels to people affected by the pandemic and also affected by poverty. So it was like doing really good community work, and it was very well liked and so on. And Patrick Corrigan of Amnesty International immediately set up a GoFundMe page and made about £60,000 in a really short time. The original target was 10, I think, and in no time at all he had this big, large sum of money. So they're going to rebuild the centre. So there's competing things going on there. There is still a very strong strand of racism in the north. And but on the other hand, there's a lot of people there who wish to welcome people from elsewhere and see them as being a very positive force for good. There are some very well-established communities and community groups there, like the Indian community has a very strong presence in the north now. But there are a lot of people coming in who are like people coming here seeking asylum, and they have a hard time. It's left up to local community groups to try to give them support and give them language classes and so on. So it's quite a mixed picture. But there is racism. I mean, I used to think of it as almost being like, immediately after the peace process, it was like leftover hatred to burn. Who are we going to turn it on? And there was a bit of that. But I think new communities becoming part of the texture of the north is entirely to be welcomed.
Hi, Susan. How much shifting have the churches done in the last 20 years, given the persistence of segregated education in spite of large popular support for integration?
Well, I think that the churches have not played a very honourable role, really. I think they're quite self-congratulatory about the role that they've played, and I don't think it's been as good as it should and could have been. For example, they're still holding out. The only time that they come together seems to be like to oppose abortion or to oppose same-sex marriage. That's when you see all the church leaders coming together. And if you look at that trap that they set for President Higgins, with that event, that shouldn't have been done in that way. So, but then I'm quite anti-religious, so I'm a bit biased in this regard. But I've interviewed quite a lot of people in the book who are from religious backgrounds, and there are a lot of people in the north who are seeking religious outlets, and so there are quite a lot of new churches which are quite progressive. There's one in Larne, for example, where lots of gay people go, and there are churches that support women who have had abortions and things. But a lot of people in the established churches reject those churches and think that they're not for real. But no, I think the churches have been very conservative, and they have, as you say, opposed integrated education in a way which isn't helpful. I know integrated education is not the answer to everything, but it would definitely make a big difference if there was more of it available in the north.
Just wanted to ask, you mentioned the panic and the lack of confidence that might be in the
Sorry,
union.
I can't hear you.
Sorry, you mentioned the lack of confidence and the panic that might be in the unionist community at the moment, and also the populism, both in the north of Ireland and the south of Ireland of Sinn Féin, while alluding or mentioning the road signs, the celebration of terrorist acts in Fermanagh. When do we get, or in your opinion, how do we get to normal politics in the north? And and what's the pathway for that? Is there going to be a generosity of spirit the other way from a Republican movement that sees victory down the road?
Well, I think there's definitely a need for the Republican community to be very, very careful in the way that it reacts to growing evidence that there's an upward trajectory for the notion of a united Ireland in both jurisdictions, and I think that's another thing that Colm to being missed. You know, I think there was an RTE poll on Friday that showed that 67% of people in the Republic at this point would vote for unification in a border poll, and the figures in the north are changing all the time. But I saw a tweet by Gerry Adams the other day which was quite triumphalist, and I just thought, that people really need to catch themselves on about that. That's not going to help. And if there's, unionists are not going to be banished. And I think a lot of unionists feel as if they are going to be banished, so it's really important that, I think it's really, really important that the Republic realises that if there's to be some form of Irish unity, the Republic is also going to have dramatically to change. It's not going to be a case of just sort of bringing in these grievance-ridden sectarian people from the north, as sort of damaged refugees. The whole place is going to have to change. There's going to have to be a new constitution. There's going to have to be a radical transformation, which would be entirely for the good, I think. But it's a huge undertaking. But I think Brexit has been a good lesson to people, because the rush with which that was done has resulted in absolutely disastrous outcomes. So I think most people realise that if there's to be a border poll, it's going to need to be quite a slow process, and a lot of work is going to have to be done to ensure that people understand that it will be an inclusive Ireland.
One more question from the audience, and then we're going to have to go to our virtual audience to get a couple of questions. This lady down at the front here.
Bert, I might ask the first online question while we're waiting. Yeah. So may run two questions together, Susan, because they are related. A comment about Derek Matten valuing the importance of words in a biblically infused culture. I'm wondering if that's something you identify with. And related, what in your views have been the principal forces shaping the Protestant imagination? Is it the religious tradition?
I didn't catch the first bit of that about from the question bit.
It was about Derek Matten valuing words as part of the biblical culture, as it were, from the Protestant background.
Well, there's a one line, I think it's called, it's named after Exodus, is it? It's named after one of the books of the Old Testament anyway, and it's talking about a person sort of saying, like, close one eye and be king, and I think that kind of represents a particular strand of narrow unionism, that, it's easy to be a leader in the north if you just dig your heels in, but it's not the kind of leadership that's kind of needed now. I think the north is very imbued with the biblical. People use a lot of biblical language. People use biblical metaphors, and everybody understands what they're talking about. Don't you find that, Martin? Like, it's very much part of everyday language in the north in a way that it's
there's a famous thing. It's the opening scene of Cal from Bernard McClaverty, the film version anyway, where a preacher is hammering a biblical tract into a tree. Like I said, I was up the north just the other day and driving past a Protestant church, and there was sort of thing, join the Lord's army, and I'm kind of thinking, really, is that a careful use of language?
No, I spend a lot of time shouting at those signs. They are all over the place. I always want to see somebody pinning one up, because you always feel it's going to be some person in 18th century garb. Yeah,
like it is kind of quite bleak, and quite often the messages are not the cheeriest the verses that you could pick from the Bible. Usually it's the wages of sin is death or the like. But
so,
in the middle there.
Hi, thank you, Susan. I took a group of Leaving Cert history students up to Derry, and we went to the apprentice boys, and were brought around by a sort of 30-something apprentice man, and he was he was incredibly patronising towards me. And I was just wondering if you think there's a link between feminism and the lessening of sectarianism amongst young people. Because to be honest with you, the kids were quite shocked at how he spoke to me.
Yeah.
And I was quite shocked about how he spoke to me. And I asked him like about women in the apprentice boy movement, and he said, well, we allowed them make sandwiches, you know. And the kids, these were, you know, these were, and we are from a school that would be from, I suppose would have the same leaning towards him. And he was just incredible. It was like talking to somebody from, you know, 1920s. It was really odd, and they were shocked. And I was just wondering if you think there's a link with the growth of feminism and
yeah, I definitely,
that sort of feeling.
I definitely do. I mean, there's a couple of, I was saying to Martin earlier that it's one of the strands that moves between the two books is that disrespect of women. In the Northern Protestants on Shifting Ground, I interview a woman from a working class housing estate in Mid-Ulster, and she talked about how as a girl from a poor background, she did well for herself, and she was never expected to do well, and no investment was put in her, and it was kind of like almost frowned upon that she turned out to be clever and ambitious. And she said, you know, in the working class unionist community, it doesn't do for women to do well. You kind of have to hide the fact that you're trying to move into what they see as being a male sphere. People used to ask me when I did the first book, Northern Protestants and Unsettled People, how I got a lot of the men in it to talk so frankly to me. And thinking back, I think it was probably because I was a lot younger at that stage, and I think a lot of them thought, oh, this wee girl, sure, she won't know what we're talking about anyway. You know, and there is a deeply patronising attitude towards women. And of course, in Orange culture, women do play a subsidiary role, and that's linked to the question about the Bible. You know, there is a whole sort of thing about, you know, that the woman is the helpmeet. You know, the woman shouldn't be out there putting herself in the foreground. It's not befitting, you know. So, but I definitely think that there's been a couple of generations of feminists now in the North, and that has changed a lot. I mean, some of the most progressive young people that you'll meet in the North now have had feminist mothers, you know, and it's really great to see it.
And there is the other side of it is the alienating effect of patriarchal attitudes from mainstream unionism. Like I'm thinking Ian Paisley Jr. was asked what he would say to Theresa May after some development in the Brexit Northern Ireland Protocol standoff, and his answer was a cup of tea and no sugar.
Yeah.
Which sums up a lot about him as a person and as a politician.
Yet another abysmal insight into Ian Paisley Jr. It's quite a list of them at this stage.
Again, we're running out of time.
Our last question is from our online audience, and it's about the Protestant background, and wondering what you yourself most value from your own Protestant background.
What I value from it?
What you value most from your Protestant background?
Well, I don't know. I wasn't brought up in a very religious household. My father was Presbyterian, my mother was Church of Ireland. She never liked the Presbyterian Church, and they never really... So we got brought sort of intermittently to the local Presbyterian church, and my mother willingly and happily stayed at home and made the dinner, you know, speaking of our previous question. But so I wasn't really brought up very religiously. There are things that I value about being from the North, you know, like I think that I think that Northerners don't take things for granted. You're constantly sort of on your toes. You're thinking that you might have to defend yourself at any moment. You know, you're used to interrogation of one kind or another. You're used to difficult questions. And so I think it makes for a kind of an inquiring, restless mind, you know. So I'd rather say that I find things of value of being a Northerner, being brought up in an unsettled place. I like hymns. I love the music in the Protestant church.
Right, well, at that point, I think it's time to show our appreciation for a very stimulating and enlightening talk. Thank you, Susan and Martin. Now, unlike in past years, we won't be able to hold signing sessions in the foyer, I'm afraid. But Susan was busy signing books beforehand, so you can get a signed copy in the foyer from our good friends at Gutter Bookshop. So the next event is at 12:30, and that's with Miles Dungan and Katrina Crowe on Miles' book about his family's experiences during the Civil War. It sounds like it's going to be a wonderful event. So, 1:30, my apologies. Jeez, if it's 12:30, we wouldn't have much time left. And the other thing we have to tell you is that, unlike in past years, we're not able to remain in the building. We have to vacate the building and come back in again. So we'll hope to see you at 1:30 for Miles and Katrina, and thanks for coming along.